I'm Miwa Messer. I'm the producer and host of Pour It Over, and I have been so looking forward to this conversation with Carvell Wallace. I actually knew him more from his journalism because he did this profile of Terrell Alvin McRaney, a playwright that I adore. And of course, there's the Samuel Jackson profile that made me realize I don't actually swear more than Sam Jackson in real life. And that was a revelation for me. There's also Michael B. Jordan and Riz Ahmed. Lots of great stuff. And of course, Finding Fred, the podcast about Mr. Rogers that I think we're all still talking about because Mr. Rogers. But Carvell, more importantly, you have a memoir and it is extraordinary.
Oh, thank you.
And I am so excited to talk to you about this book.
Thank you.
But when did you realize that the book is the thing you needed to do? I mean, we know you from your profile work. We know you from the podcasting. We know you from lots of other kinds of journalism that you've done. But a book?
Yeah, I mean, I think that it feels like a little bit of a natural progression for a writer to be like, okay, it's time for me to do a book. I don't remember making a decision. I don't remember what I was thinking when I was like, oh, I'm going to try and make a book. I just was like, I guess that's what you do now. Like you try and get paid book money instead of article money. That's what's next on the agenda. So that was 2019 when I wrote that proposal, 2018, 2019, and I sold the book in 2019, I believe.
Okay. One of the things I've been sort of obsessing about as I've been prepping for this interview with you is the idea of voice, right? Voice is the thing that I need when I'm in a book. Everyone has their thing that they read for, right? But for me, it's voice. If I don't have the voice, if I don't have the overarching narrative voice, then, I can finish anything, but it's better if I have voice. And one of the things I'm completely fascinated about is when you're writing a profile, yeah, you have the voice as the writer, but you've got to have the voice of your subject, right? You've also co-authored a book with Andre Iguodala, The Sixth Man, which if you're a basketball person, you need to read this book. If you're not a basketball person, I'm still going to recommend it because it's a great story. But again, there, you've got to keep Andre's voice first and foremost. And this memoir of yours, Another Word for Love, gorgeous, sublime, extraordinary book. But it's you finding your voice. And it's a little messy in all the best ways.
Yeah.
Really honest.
Yeah.
A little dark sometimes. A little dark. But watching you find your voice is, I think, the best part. But you as a writer, I mean, you come out of nonprofits. You kind of joke about being a 40-year-old freshman when you get your first writing gig.
Yeah.
The voice, though, when did you figure out the voice of Carvell Wallace?
I don't know that I have figured it out yet. I think it's ever evolving. I did a lot of writing before I ever got paid to write. And I think I tried a lot of voices on over that time. Some worked, more well than others. I also went to school for theater and was an actor. And so, but in college, I focused on making my own work and being making theater and writing scripts and creating pieces. And so I think I found some of my artistic voice through that, just knowing that there's that I have a weird, perhaps specific way of dealing with humor, but seriousness, dealing with earnestness, but also commenting on the earnestness. And so I just followed that to whatever extent I can. There's all kinds of voice influences that I take little pieces of from all over the place. I think of being the age I am, I'm almost 50. And so I'm a Gen Xer and I came up in the 90s and, I read all these writers like Greg Tate, Mark Morford, all these writers who were super voicey, to the point where it was almost relax a little bit. And so I was inspired by that. And I think for a while I thought, well, that's what you're supposed to do. If you're a writer, you're supposed to be haha, crack a joke, obscure reference, this, that, long sentences, and so did that for a while. But ultimately I was no, I don't think that's me. I think that's them. And I get to find my own way of taking some piece of that. So I do like to move up and down the ladder of abstraction when I write, going in deep for something and earnestly describing a moment, the cells, the air, everything, and then stepping back and making a comment, but not hanging out too much in either space, just kind of moving between them as a way of sort of indicating the connection between all things. So that might be maybe the way I would think of my voice.
Yeah, I'm also going to quote you for a second. A lot of things I've learned can be true at once.
Yeah.
Right? I feel like you're pulling from music, you're pulling from movies. Clearly, You have read deeply in fiction, narrative nonfiction, probably a little poetry too, but
Yeah, for sure.
Okay, so all of these places, and certainly, your background as an actor. But the other thing that caught me about Another Word for Love is that you give your mom a voice that I think she didn't actually have in life.
Mm.
And I mean, I'm
Hmm.
pretty clear. Obviously, I never met your mother in real life, but I feel like I know her on the
Mhm.
page, and I have a really deep empathy for her. Can I ask you to introduce your mom to listeners?
Gladly. I mean, I think the first thing I thought of when you said that is that I was a little surprised when you said a voice that she didn't have in real life because
Mhm.
that may be true, but that's not true for me.
Right.
She did have that voice in my life, and I think I wanted to share that with people because she was such a charming person, and I mean that's not the right word, but and so my mother, Parthenia Wallace, was the youngest of 19 children. She left home very young and she got pregnant very young. She lived in New York for a while with her older sister and had a bunch of adventures there. I have heard both that sister and her have passed on, so I can never find the source of this. But I've heard that they at one point dated some players from the New York Yankees in that time.
Okay.
And so like I know that they were up there having a ball, as my aunt would say. And then my mother got pregnant fairly young, like I think she got pregnant when she was 19. She had me when she was 20. And her life, she was a person who now, when I look back on it, really longed to be a kind of person that her life circumstances didn't allow her to be. She was incredibly creative. She was wildly smart, like one of the smartest people I've ever known. And she was emotional and she loved beauty and loved like finding beauty in all kinds of places. She loved adorning herself with things. I would sit and watch her put on makeup and earrings, and I would just be transfixed by her, the way that she like cared for herself. And, it's like she was meant to be like a sort of rich bon vivant person in another time who just
Right.
sort of traveled around and made love and wrote and like was at parties and stuff. But she wasn't that. She was a single mom, with a kid in LA and who didn't make a lot of money. And so I watched her try to build the life that she wanted within like the very strict limitations of what we had systemically and financially. And so I think when she died fairly young. She was a pack a day smoker, and eventually it caught up with her. And I think one of the things that I felt after she died was that I wanted to honor her liberation. I wanted to free her from the things that held her back in the world that she was in, and I wanted to like honor the places where she could be free to be who she was. And so some of that comes through in my writing. And you know, one of the reasons that's important to me is because I think she recognized that I was an artist at a very young age and she supported that. And that wasn't the case I had for most people. Like some people I think were reluctant about, it's like you don't let's like get a real job. What are you going to do if it doesn't work out? That kind of thing. My mother was known for her impracticality. You know what I mean? And so she was like, "Oh, I get it. You're an artist. You're a creative person. You want to make beautiful things. I want you to go and be the most successful artist that you can, and I want you to like fully realize that." And so it feels to me that whatever success I have as an artist is inextricably linked to her dreams. And so for me, she's always present in that work.
I love hearing that. There are 3 sections in this book. Stories about loss, stories about God, stories
Hmm.
about return, and I love the structure
Hmm.
of this memoir, and each chapter has its own title.
Hmm.
Some chapters are long, some chapters are time is, really elastic,
Hmm.
and it is not linear in
Hmm.
this book,
Hmm.
and it feels like you've let me into the back of your brain.
Hmm.
And I'm sure memory plays into this and the way memory is
Hmm.
elastic and funky and does what it
Hmm.
does. So
Hmm.
let's work around the structure of this book for a second.
Yeah. Well, I always keep in mind that memoir, that word is related to the word for memory. And so I think of it, some of my friends who aren't really readers are like, "Oh, I can't wait to read your autobiography." And I'm like, that's not an it's not an autobiography, but I get where you're coming from. But actually, and so it's forced me to think about why it's not an autobiography because it's an evocation of memory. It's not a story of everything that happened to me from beginning to end. And, the elasticity of time in it is as much a function of trauma as it is a function of memory, because my experience is that trauma tends to make certain moments go on forever and also makes other moments disappear entirely. And I also think that that ties into a kind of, not to get too weird, but kind of a cosmic understanding that time is effectively fake, that
Mhm.
our perception is that time is a function of our perception, in that as we perceive time differently, time is different. And so I wanted the book to at least create that feeling for the reader that you've stepped into something that is a step out of our rigid way of looking at time. That now we're going into a different place, a place that where the time is guided by the human experience and not by the clock experience, if that makes sense.
Yeah,
So
it
yeah.
does, especially because, or at least for me, since COVID, my sense of time has gotten a little
Mm,
squirrely.
yeah.
And, there are moments where I really have to think, was that 2020? Was that
Right.
2021? And when you're in the book business, you're sort of walking around with 4 calendars in your head at any
Mm-hmm.
given moment. There's like
Mm-hmm.
what happened recently, where you're
Mm-hmm.
now, and even sometimes 5 calendars. I mean, it's just,
Mm-hmm.
you have to think on lots of different planes at any given moment. And now I have to sort of stop a little more and say, right, okay, it's not
Mm-hmm.
just, am I thinking about spring of 21? It's like, why
Mm-hmm.
don't I double check that year?
Mm-hmm.
And it's a weird place to be. I mean, that's part of the joy of reading, right? Like you can dip in and out of someone else's timeline, someone else's
Yeah.
details, like all of that kind of stuff. But to have that happen in real life
Yeah.
is occasionally uncomfortable.
It
Let's
it's
put it
cer-
that
it can be, because it makes us feel like we're out of step with like the system
way.
that
Right.
is so important for us to survive. But I think as I grow older, and in writing this book, this, became even more clear to me that I'm taking a little bit of a gamble on the way that I perceive time, that I'm allowing myself to trust feeling and emotion more. I used to always say that you can always predict the future if you tell the truth, because the truth never changes. And so that was a little bit of a guideline for how I wrote this book, that the calendar time would be less important. And as a
Mm-hmm.
writer, I know to stick to calendar time. And when I first started working for the New Yorker, I remember not working, but writing as a freelancer for the New Yorker. I remember one of the first big lessons that I got from my editor, David Haglund, was like, you have to put this on a grid. You have to snap this to the calendar grid first. And that was super helpful for that kind of writing. And I always guide that when I teach students. I always tell them that that's like one of the parts. But then I think in this book, I got to then break that rule. I got to like sort of understand it, but then break it, and break it consciously, with the idea that we're going to again take a gamble to focus on the time of emotion rather than the time of the calendar, and see if that doesn't open up more possibilities for how we receive this book.
Well, I think it's also really important for men to be able to do that. I mean, Hanif
Mm,
Abdur-Rakib's new book, There's Always This Year, he does that beautifully. I mean, he does it in all of his work, but the way he talks about vulnerability and masculinity and our
hmm
expectations. And you
hmm
do it too. I mean, you talk about how violence sort of shapes us and how boys and men are taught to sort of hold it all together, to not let anything leak. I am
hmm
paraphrasing you, but
hmm
there's a lot of powerful language in Another Word for Love about masculinity and violence
hmm
and vulnerability. I don't want to say it's exciting to see it on the page, but it feels still very new. And I'm excited to
hmm
see that we can have language like this and that you can explore this on the page in a way that maybe we couldn't have even 10 years ago.
Yeah,
Right.
maybe. I mean, I hope it doesn't stay new for long. It's funny because you said that I'm obviously a big reader, and I don't know if I, if I am or not. Sometimes I'm like, gee, you don't read a lot for someone who makes a living from books, but I do read. But I think I also take care not to get too ensconced in like writing trends, because it can make it hard for me to hear that little tiny truth in the back of my head about what to write. Because I'm someone who, as soon as I see something, I'm like, oh, that's what I should be doing. And I start trying to imitate. And
Oh.
so I think that when I was writing this, it didn't feel to me, for that reason, because I hadn't read like 30 books on masculinity and 400 like men's memoirs. The guiding thing was just like, tell the truth, tell the truth, tell the truth, find the beauty, tell the truth. Like that's sort of the guideline. So I don't know how in there or out of the mainstream it is or isn't. I would like to think that I don't feel like I'm like inventing anything in this book. I feel like I'm synthesizing all the things that I've seen, witnessed, shared, have been told, understood, etc.
I've been in the book business a really, really long time. Really, really long time. So the context that I have is slightly different from yours. And it's partially watching the culture and language change and watching that, books aren't always the fastest to reflect a pop culture moment. And they're also not necessarily something you can write quickly. I mean, there are the stories of people who wrote something in a white hot 6 weeks or, it happens. I mean, everyone has a different way of approaching the work. But reading Another Word for Love makes me think that all of this, we're watching you find the words, but the way you're doing it, like, I feel like I know members of your family. I mean, you were raised intermittently by aunts and uncles. But even when you sketch them, I feel like I understand who these people are. Like, you were growing up in Appalachia, in like rural Pennsylvania. You were the only Black kid for miles and miles and miles, at a point where that was more complicated even than it would be now. So here you are, like, you're wrestling through the isolation, you're wrestling through lots of things, and yet we get a beautiful piece of writing on the other side of it. Like, that comes with time and maturity and reflection and a willingness to be vulnerable, which it's a lot.
Well, I mean, I want to say too, it wasn't, I mean, rural is not the word I would use to describe where it was. It was like, I mean, I don't know how familiar you are with Southwestern PA, but it's sort of like you've got Pittsburgh and then you've got a bunch of towns around it. And then, and each of these towns is like its own kind of small little steel town. I mean, the town that I was born in, McKeesport, shout out McKeesport, there's, and it was, I think at most population was like 150,000 people. And then it got smaller and smaller as the steel industry collapsed and as crack took over, and it became kind of this like really, last time I went there was in 2017. It's, it feels like a ghost town, quite literally. I then moved up to these sort of suburbs of McKeesport, if that's a thing, which is, this town, White Oak, which was like more suburban than rural. But in that context, I was like the only Black kid for sure everywhere. And I think I say in the book, it was like living on the moon. And I was also an only child, and I moved around a lot. I went to 10 different schools by the time I was in 11th grade. I had different family members raising me at different points. So that probably helped develop, for me, who was maybe already born like to be an artist, that helped develop my artistic outlook too, because it's like, I have never not thought to create stuff out of what I'm experiencing. It's just, my brain doesn't do anything else. It does it compulsively. So it's almost like a no-brainer that it's almost like I don't have a choice, actually, is what it feels like.
As a reader, I'm happy to hear that. As a human being, part of me feels like, are you okay? Both things can be true. I mean, reading you on the page is exhilarating in a lot of ways, but you do go through a lot. And there was a moment you did a roundtable for Slate with Jelani Cobb, among other writers. And one of the things you talked about was not wanting to always write about trauma and pain, and wanting to write about beauty and love and relation and all of the good stuff too. And I think part of why that profile you did of Terrell Alvin McRaney stuck with me too is, he's in a similar boat, right? Where he can't separate the pain of his characters from the characters. That's part of the point of the art. And yet he turns the tables on you during your profile, and he starts asking you all these questions. Yeah. But it all comes back to beauty. And I think this is a larger conversation that not just Black writers are having, but other writers of color, where it's just like, what is the obligation to writing to the trauma and the pain? How much of that is performative? How much of it is just simply the truth, unfortunately? I mean, that is the reality of it. But also, when do we just get to tell a story where people are sitting around the dinner table and like, it's... Yeah, that's right. I think about this all the time. And one of my favorite, I remember I was interviewed for something years ago, and one of the questions was something like, it was by a writer named Ebony Haight, who's a local writer here in San Francisco. And she asked this question of like,
what would you write about if you didn't have to write about race at all, or something like that. And I always keep that question in the back of my mind. It's because for me, I think at the beginning of my career, when I look back on some of my early work, I do feel like I was doing a little bit of like performing Black pain for a paycheck in ways that I don't love re-encountering. And yet not I wasn't doing all that, but there was more of that there then than there is now. With this book, this is where the structure became really important to me because I already knew that there is an appetite for Black pain, but and I've written this in I did a piece about horror movies for The Atlantic where I talked about this, that it's a form of entertainment in this country, unfortunately. And so for me, I knew that I had to engage with the sources of hurt, but that the book had to be about recovery, not about suffering. And I didn't want the book to prioritize suffering as its main thing. And so that's kind of the structure was in some ways born from that. I once drew a diagram of the structure that was sort of like an upside down U. It was or upside down V, or no, that's a right side up V. It's sort of like we begin at early points, and then as each traumatic event happens, this character, the main character, is like separated from sense of self more and more as these things happen. And that's the first sort of third of the book. And then the rest of it is about all the different ways in which this character finds his way back to self-ownership, to fullness, to wholeness. And that's an ongoing process. So it's a meditation on how one goes about that work, I mean, it's not a map on how to do it, although some people may call it that, because I don't truly know the answers. I'm in process. But I wanted the focus of the book and the majority of the text in the book to be about recovering from trauma, not about experiencing trauma.
There's a piece in the last third called The Bread,
Mm.
and it describes a very singular, gorgeous day in your life. But it's literally you baking bread and the rain is coming down and you're listening to Solange's out, like just all of these moments. And yet there is this undercurrent of grief.
Yeah.
That never takes over in a way. Like I'm still smiling thinking about this riff that you're doing because I'm like, yeah, I get that day. I totally get that. And you and I do not have similar stories, but the fact that I was so deep in this essay, right? Can we have more of those days? Can we have more of those? Seriously, these little moments, like you pop with these lines in lots of different points in the book where I either laughed out loud or I thought, oh, yeah, this guy gets it. This guy gets it. And again, like our stories don't really overlap. Yeah. We're, both Gen X Americans, but like our stories don't entirely overlap. And yet I feel like I have a really good idea of who you are and where you're going, and like watching you learn how to parent. And then you turn out to be like the parenting guru at Slate. Come on. Come on. Mom and dad are fighting. That was kind of great. I'm happy to be an auntie. But, watching all of these pieces, right? Like, I mean, your childhood could be described as chaotic, and yet you have figured out a different way to do it with your own tiny people who are closer to adults than tiny people at this point. And again, I keep coming back to this idea of transformation and vulnerability and a willingness to be open in a way that we don't often teach men to do. I mean, certainly we don't teach a lot of people to do it, but I'm focusing on men because it is your story. And it's kind of great to see.
Well, I appreciate you saying that. Like, I think that one of the things that I discovered through the writing of the book that I felt a long time, but I didn't know how to put words to it till I wrote it, is that the reason you have to do that work of vulnerability and transformation is because of your responsibility to other people. Like, that is the thing. It's like I am responsible to other people. It is not enough that I was hurt and that this bad thing happened to me. That's terrible. Like, but ultimately I'm responsible to other people. And the real, like the clearest aspect of that is that when you have kids, because here come these babies and they're just like, well, I don't care that someone was like mean to you when you were 8. I need your love. And I need you to show up in that love, and I need you to deal with whatever stands in the way of your ability to show up in that love, because I just got here and I'm innocent. So I think that in some ways, that realization maybe began with my kids, but it is like grown and grown and grown to encompass like everyone that I encounter. I often think about life as being a little bit like you're just kind of thrown here and then you have to figure out something to do until you die. And so I like to have things to do that I'm never going to run out of material for. I like to play like, read a book that doesn't have an ending. And so trying to learn how to love better I'm never going to like be done with that. I'm not going to reach a point where I'm like, okay, that's done. Now let me put up shelves. Like this is a lifelong pursuit. So I'm excited to like, let this be I would say my primary thing.
It's a practice. Love is a practice, and love can be really hard. And I am frequently reminded of that when I am not feeling love for my fellow humans. That's when it pings and I'm like,
Yes.
oh,
Yeah.
I need to do better about this. But we live in sort of challenging times, and we do. But, when you phrase it in terms of, I don't care who was mean to you when I was 8, I need you now, it changes your perspective. And you did this really wonderful profile of sort of the production of Good Lord Bird, which was Ethan Hawke bringing James McBride's National Book Award winning novel to the screen. And I love this piece that you did because you just dug in. You were like, I am not writing the thing that you all expect I'm going to write. Like, and honestly, if you're listening to this and you haven't read it, it's in the New York Times. Just please go find it. It is one of the greatest pieces of TV criticism, cultural criticism, celebrity profile. You do all of the things in this piece. And I really quite enjoyed it. And I thought you were also very fair. But one of the things that struck me is this thing that McBride said that brought me back to you in this book, where he's just like, you just have to listen for all of the big stories, right? Like you have to just figure out that you can, in fact, love everyone. And again, I keep coming back to this idea where some days I can do that. And some days I'm like, no.
Yeah,
you can't make me.
Yeah, it's funny that you brought that up. I mean, that interview with McBride, I definitely was really adamant about leaving that line in there because it tells a secondary story. So there's like the story of the thing. And then I went to interview McBride, his thoughts. And, he gave me all his thoughts on the thing. And it's like, okay, we're doing this like magazine piece. But then sort of towards the end, McBride insists on calling me a young writer, which I find hilarious because I'm 50 years old. And even in the blurb, he was like, one of the finest young writers. I was like, he called me young? Like, that's more exciting to me than the fact that he likes my work. But, he said towards the end, one of the problems with young writers is you guys are always looking for problems. If you look for what's good, you can find some of the best stories in the world. And I left that in there because it really struck me at the time. It was like really powerful advice from one writer to another. And he is older than me. So I do look up to him for sure. I love him as a craftsman and as a pro stylist, especially in Good Lord Bird. It has been something of a guiding principle for me, like or something that I'm open to, like, what if he's right? And I think that did have a huge impact on how I went about writing this book.
I think you have to be generous to yourself. I mean, here I am coming back to this idea of transformation and vulnerability and everything else, but it feels a little bit like you're writing a profile of Carvell Wallace.
Yeah.
It feels a little bit like that, but it's also, you are generous to the people around you. You are generous to the world and our systems, which are plenty busted. And again, I keep coming back to this idea of watching you figure it out, right? Like the way you're talking about how this is a book more about the recovery from trauma and not about the litany of traumas. And it's just, the idea that love is a practice, that generosity is a practice. Like we talk about kindness all the time. And, as a culture and, it's having its pop culture moment. Let's hope it lasts. But these things kind of never really seem to have real longevity. The summer of 2020 feels like a really long time ago.
It was a very long time ago.
And you and I are taping this in 2024, and it's just like, it feels like a lifetime ago. But do you feel relief putting this out, having this book out? I mean, you've got people in the back of your brain in a way, and you've always been pretty open. I mean, there was the podcast you did in 2017?
Closer Than They Appear.
Yeah.
With
I mean, there's some mention of it, obviously, and the McKeesport trip is there as well. And when you go back to talk to the best friend you hadn't seen in 30 years. But yeah, I'm just wondering, I mean, there's a lot of you and a lot of truth and some surprising moments. There was some stuff that I was like, oh, okay. Wasn't expecting that. But here we are. I mean, how does it feel to have this out?
I don't know. I don't know how it feels yet. I actually think that after the end of the sort of like intensive book tour promotion season, I'll feel a lot differently about it than I will at the beginning. I think I'm glad that it's done. I'm glad it's off my desk. I'm proud of it. You know, I wasn't sure if I would be. I wasn't sure if I would, finish. And I was like afraid that I would be like, this is terrible. I can't believe, And so I feel okay about the work. And I'm glad that it's so far been well received. I'm sure it won't always be by everyone. But so all that is fine. And I'm glad to have gotten all this stuff sort of not off my chest is not the right way to say it, but I'm glad that I've been able to show up authentically as myself in public forum, which for me is like huge growth and healing. So that's what I know. I was talking to another writer about this a long time ago, and I was, kind of quaking in my boots about this book, and they said to me, "Well, what you don't know yet is the freedom you're going to experience when it's done. The freedom that's on the other side of this." And so I have started to experience that. That is a lot of what it feels like. I don't have to be I don't feel afraid of any aspect of myself. I trust in the work of love, the work of becoming better, which includes examining unloving and ungood things in yourself. I trust in that work. It's not always pleasant, but I trust in it, and so I trust in that as an ongoing practice.
Well, and authenticity, I think, is something that all of us as human beings gravitate towards, right? Like you can tell when someone's phoning it in. You can tell when someone is showing up because they're being paid to do a thing, right? Like authenticity is hard. I mean that in the nicest way, but like it's hard.
Yeah, and I would say that's what I was quite afraid of going into this because I know myself well enough to know. I mean, I've done, I think I have a fairly active inventory of all of my shortcomings, and it's not like I'm free of it, but I at least sort of know what it is. I think about this Pema Chodron quote that where she said something to the effect of, and I'm paraphrasing, like, my meditation practice didn't rid me of my character defects, it made me a connoisseur of them. And so I feel like I can be like, oh yeah, there's that thing again where you're trying to impress people. Oh, there's that thing again where you assume everyone is thinking the worst of. Oh, there's that thing again, but you don't really want to tell the whole truth because you don't know what people are going to say. So I get to see those things and be in relationship with them, and then try to work through them.
You bring me back though to something that you've said, and you've said it in a couple of different ways in a couple of different places. But do you know that love is meant to be liberation? Right. And that's kind of what Pema's talking about too. It's like, you get to be aware of all of the stuff and loving yourself with all of like the myriads of mess. I mean, liberation is a word that I go back and forth on.
Oh, interesting.
It's such a 70s word, but the idea that awareness, right, that you can admit that something is going on. I mean, that really, there's so many people who can't even get that far.
Yeah, maybe. And I mean, that's part of what, I always think of the work of being a writer is a little bit, especially writing about the self, is that, well, what is the purpose of this? Because like, do I just want to talk about myself for like 240 pages?
Right.
Hopefully I have a slightly higher ambition than that. And part of it is like that thing at the party where you want to be the first person on the dance floor so that everyone else can start dancing. Like, I feel like it's kind of like that. Like, that's part of the reason why we write about ourselves. We do it to explore our own stuff. We do it to share, but we also do it to open up a space for other people to do the work that we're demonstrating. It's not like we own the work. It's that we're making it like, oh, like actually you could do this. And other people were like, okay, I can do a little bit of that. That sounds good. So to me, I would like to reclaim the word liberation. I have learned over the past year or so that people do have strong feelings about that word, which is not a thing I knew. And the reason I like the word liberation as opposed to anything else is because inherent in it, and this may be part of the 70s, 80s thing you're talking about, it implies the political. And it's not self-love for the sake of self-love, and it's not self-care for the sake of buying like candles and propping up the yoga mat industry. it's particularly about working towards your freedom within a political context, which is really important for me.
I like your definition better than mine. It also, like, I'm just reminded that language ebbs and flows, and language isn't linear, right?
No.
Like, it's just stuff comes and goes, and linguistics is not my thing. Semantics is not really my thing, but like being able to connect with another human being using words is a marvel and a wonder to me. The fact that we can do this, it's really kind of amazing. And like, doesn't matter what your background is, doesn't matter like how you grew up or where, like the idea that we as human beings, like not just you and I, but like we, like the grand we, right, can connect using words is, I love it to bits. I mean, that's why I'm a bookseller. Like I can't imagine doing anything else, you know, or watching like a profile form of the page. You did this kind of legendary write-around on Steph Curry for the New Yorker, and I still laugh when I think about this piece. Because you're clearly like early in your career, right? Like it's not long after you've done that piece for the Toast about the Green Book, which is another piece I love. But like, I respect anyone who can do a write-around. I love write-arounds. Like, okay, Frank Sinatra has a cold. Like, Patrick Radden Keefe does a write-around really well. Like, and this idea, though, that you need like the voice and the muscle and the presence to be able to do a write-around. And again, also, if you haven't read that, it's in the New Yorker. Go find it. It's great.
That was a lot of fun. Yeah.
But it shows, right? Like it's clear to me when you are having a good time on the page, whether it's a profile. Sorry, Sam Jackson's golf foursome is weird. That was not the foursome I was expecting. Like I was just kind of like, what? And who is that guy? What?
Yeah. But that is such a Hollywood, that's such an LA thing that you see all these, we have these characters siloed in our minds. Oh, this is the one from this comedy show. This is the one from this very serious prestige drama. And then you walk into a restaurant and then they're all sitting together with some like person who was, you know, played like the goofy neighbor on a show in like 1987 for half a season. They're all, you know, it's just like because, you know, people are in it. So I find that really funny. So I wanted to uplift that in that piece, that's a real LA thing.
But also the level of detail, right? Like you notice everything. You know, and I don't know how much you leave out, but you notice things the way a novelist notices detail, and you just find a way to slip it in. Like I never feel like I see you writing. I never feel like I see you saying, now I'm going to tell you a story, children. Like it's none of it's just kind of like Carvells hanging out. I mean, that Riz Ahmed profile that you did, I was just like, dude, what is happening here? And like, I would feel a little weird if someone kept pushing their plate at me. Like, if I know you, that's a different thing. Like, I will eat off my friends' plates all the time, but like, I don't know you. What is happening here?
I feel like one thing that I learned creatively in experimental theater school is this question of like the relationship between the form and the content.
Okay.
And that actually the form it's really powerful when the form does reflect the content on some level. And so with the Riz Ahmed piece, I was aware after hanging out with him that that his energy was the way it was described in the piece, that he's powerful, he's energetic, he's kind of frenetic. It's a little bit like what's going on. You're sort of being dragged around. So I wanted the reader to feel that, like that was happening with them, you know? And yeah, I may back up as a writer and make an observation and whatever, especially towards the end, but I'm telling the story of hanging out with Riz Ahmed as much as I'm telling the story of Riz Ahmed. But particularly to go back to this thing about details and maybe why it can work the way that I use them when it does is that for me, I always think of everything as, you know, I tell students that like writing a profile is like painting a picture of someone and every detail is a source of light. And so the sources of light you choose have to point towards the subject. So it could be an interesting detail about the sky or about my shoes or whatever, but if it doesn't point towards something about the subject, then it's not a necessary detail. It's just writing for writing's sake. So I try to stick with details that illuminate something about the subject or give the reader the feeling that hanging out with that person gives you. Putting the reader in that space.
And listening to you riff right now, I just realized all of your profiles have a kinetic energy to them that I don't think I had put
Mm.
together. Even the McRaney. And he strikes me as a very sort of pulled in kind of guy, but there's an energy to that profile as well in the exchange. Because at one point too, you're talking about how he's very comfortable in silence, and you're like, oh man, if I don't start talking, he's just gonna not say a word. And you've been doing this for a really long time, and you want to meet people at their energy, right, and not just come barreling out. Like,
oh yeah, for sure.
And I was just laughing. I was like, oh yeah, I've had a couple of those where you're like, okay,
yeah, you do have to meet people where they are. I think that's like really one of the most underrated and important things about profiling is that if you're trying to get people to talk, they're not going to talk if they feel like you're not listening. And so if you come in and you're just like, here's my agenda, blah, 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 here's all my questions, then they will answer the questions, but they won't talk. They won't share. They won't reveal things. Everyone likes to be listened to, I have found, even if they say they don't. And so when you listen to people, then they get to talking about what they want to talk about. And then what they want to talk about is how you understand who they are. And understanding who they are is how you write the profile. So it all works together.
Can we talk about influences for a second? I know you've hinted that you're not really a reader, but I do not believe you because I have read your sentences. Those do not read like the sentences of a person who does not read much.
Okay.
Sorry.
I didn't say I was not really a reader. I feel like I'm not as big a reader as some other colleagues of mine who like always have 4 books. It takes me a long time to read a book. I get distracted. Half the time I'm supposed to be reading, I'm just watching Bob's Burgers. Like I waste a lot of reading time. You know what I mean? So maybe I'm judging myself too harshly. I don't know. But I'm getting better. I'm getting better as a reader for sure.
But Kaveh Akbar has blurbed your book. James McBride, Danzy, Senna, Ashley Ford, Kiese, Laymon, like writers I love have blurbed this book, which I didn't realize because I'm working off of like a bound manuscript with no stuff. And I'm just like, I just need words. I don't actually, I've known your publisher and editor for a really long time. And I was just like, just send it to me. It's fine. Yeah. But to know that people I love you and your sentences too make me very happy. But I assume you've read all of them too. I mean, heavy. For sure. Kiese is sort of sitting in a similar space. Ashley C. Ford, somebody's daughter, same thing, sitting in that space. Kaveh and Martyr sitting, like everyone's kind of sitting in that space. And I cannot wait for Colored Television, which is Dancy's new novel, to come out.
I'm so excited for Colored Television.
Banging that book. Oh, it is so good, that book.
I haven't read it yet. And I haven't read Kaveh's book either as of yet. But yeah, so sure, influences by all means. I don't, when we talk about stuff at the sentence level, that's where I'm like, I don't actually know if I have a lot of sentence level influences in my life, because I think the way that I write sentences is just very much built out of my own internal little production engine. And all the weird stuff that has shaped me. Like I'm influenced by, as I say in the book, by the language I grew up around, by hip hop for sure, by Shakespeare for sure. I'm probably more influenced by books that I read when I was like 14 than I am by books I read now, at the sentence level especially. And I read terrible books, but I was a compulsive reader, but I would read the same book over and over again. I mentioned that in the book. And one of the ones I got stuck on was the novelization of the movie The Karate Kid. I read it like 30 times in a row, and it was obviously not good, but I think that I picked up something from all those books about the sort of gestalt of a book. But I think now overall, structurally, spiritually, I'm influenced by, I only had one writing teacher ever in my life, and it was June Jordan. And I snuck into her class. My friend Sheila Menezes, who was her assistant, was like, I can get you into the P4P seminar, even though I wasn't a Berkeley student, just sit in the back and like, don't make any noise. So I stayed there for a whole time, and ended up being the last semester that she taught. I ended up spending more time with her. She kind of like started talking to me about my writing, kind of took an interest in me. And so she remains a huge influence on me. Again, I don't know. It's not like I'm going to write sentences like someone else wrote sentences. It's like the way that they approach their craft emotionally and spiritually and mentally. June and many poets' willingness to get to the core of the thing emotionally and let the readers make the plot connections is something that I was like, that speaks to me. Let me do that.
Have you started on the next thing? Is there another book coming?
Well, okay. So right now I have two ghostwriting assignments that I that I'm desperately trying to finish. And so but I am working on two more personal assignments that my brain is incubating and incubating. But I feel like you learn a lot about, I mean, I've said this to students that you don't really understand what you're writing until after you've written it. Like you don't even really know what it means. And so I'm just now learning what this book means and what else needs to be said and how.
Okay. I can wait for the ghostwriting. I understand. I can wait.
Yeah.
I'll sit here quietly and be patient. Although it sounds like you like deadlines the way I like deadlines. Sometimes you need a deadline to finish a thing, and you're like, "Yes, this is great. Thank you."
I have
so
to have
much.
deadlines. I'm an obsessive compulsive procrastinator. It's so bad. And the procrastination time is all useful because I'm always turning over ideas and thinking about things like the Solange day. I'm like thinking about stuff and getting material, but also people are like, we need the book. Where's the book? And so eventually I can't just think, I have to write. But I think there is a possibility that the next thing I do will be fiction. That is a possibility. First of all, writing about the self is exhausting. And after you do it once, even my daughter the other day told me, who's 18, she told me like, I'm just going to write fiction from now on, Dad. I'm never going to write about myself again. And I was like, damn, you're already there. But a lot of nonfiction writers who turn to fiction, I think you can operate under the misapprehension that somehow it'll be easier or that you know how to do it. And for me, I feel very respectful of the fiction process. I feel like it is like getting into the ring with like a beast. And so as much as I have ideas about that, to me, it feels very connected to the way that I approach nonfiction. Like I've always approached nonfiction like fiction, but I understand that that's not the same as actually writing fiction. It's something that I am slowly, very slowly starting to put together some visions in my head of a story that can be told that in effect explores the same things about liberation, justice, freedom, fear, transformation of the self, recovery, meaning, but I just get to start with Once Upon a Time.
Okay, I'm going to sit in the corner over there and I'm just going to wait patiently because I really want to read that book. Book, and I want to read that novel from you.
Yeah, and I think about, Danzy Senna is a friend of mine, and she once said to me about fiction that if you're writing fiction, you have to do something that you could only do in fiction.
Yeah.
As a creator, that I just love the way that opens up the possibilities because I get to be like, because I am bound in nonfiction. I get to truly explore from a craft perspective and all the like beautiful writing and stuff. I get to get in there and that's a great task. But it feels almost like you're it's a difference between examining the inner verse and the universe, nonfiction versus fiction for me. And so I can keep digging infinitely into the inner verse, and that's cool. But I'm now looking up toward the sky and being like, well, I wonder what's out there. Where can I go out there?
I do also think that writers, for the most part, will deliver the books that they need to deliver when they need to deliver them. I mean, kind of famously, Colson Whitehead wrote his, coming of age story as his fourth book.
Yeah.
And I can't remember if that came right before the zombie novel or right after the zombie novel.
Right, exactly.
You know what I mean? And it's like, well, do what you're going to do when you're going to do it. I mean, Danzy's debut, Caucasia, I have given so many copies of that book to people. I just like, that book is something I hold really, really close. And she's done a lot of great work since then, obviously. That one just hit me at exactly, it showed up when I needed it. And then I just made sure that lots of other people got to sit in that world as well. And it's so kind of great. Write a novel, don't write a novel. I mean, Vinson Cunningham, Great Expectations. I mean, that guy had me howling. Beyond the title. Which, I mean, come on. Watching his character sort of David making it through the world kind of thing. And yeah, maybe there's some details that might also belong to Vinson, but it's fiction. It's not autofiction. Like, there's so much you can do. Or like Akhtar and Homeland Elegies. Like, I have this sort of mental list of people doing cool stuff in fiction where it's like, you can totally do whatever you want.
I love stories. I mean, people, even in this, I'm like, I feel like when I read it, I can feel myself straining against the confines of nonfiction because I'm like, I just want to be like I do this once upon a time, this one time, one day it's like I love just sitting someone down and telling a story or hearing someone tell me a story. I was just thinking about this the other day because I have some friends who were like, "Oh, you already told me this story." And I'm like, "I know, that's I'm not telling you because it's new information. I'm telling you because we tell stories." It's what we do. It's fun.
And we get to listen, which is pretty great.
Yeah.
Carvell, thank you so much for joining us on Poured Over. Another Word for Love is out now, and I'll just kind of sit quietly waiting for the novel.
Thank you so much. It's such a pleasure to talk with you. Thanks for having me.
Thank you for listening. Poured Over is a Barnes & Noble production. To help other readers find us, please rate and review the show wherever you listen to podcasts.